Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 7 of our Spring Security course. So in this lesson especially, we are going to look into the login section of the Spring Security. And since most of the enterprise application will not use the default login page, we will see how you can create and configure the custom login page and how the entire process works end to end. So, and in the introduction of this course, I have already shown you how the default login page looks like and how it works, right? So in this chapter, we are going to talk about a couple of different things. Definitely, we will create a custom login page. We will also configure and integrate that with the Spring Security. So instead of having the default login page, Spring Security is going to give you the our new custom login page. We also need a login controller to handle a couple of things. Nitty-gritty is there. And again, if you remember from our previous lesson, we have used the in-memory authentication provider to authenticate the user. In this, we are going to go one step ahead, because in the last chapter we have created a registration process. So that means we already have the customer information into the database. Now in this one, we will get that information and try to authenticate the user based upon the saved information. And for that one, we are going to use one of the provider, which is a DAO authentication provider. If you're still not clear about the different authentication providers, I highly recommend you to go back to our previous lesson, which talks about the authentication provider. And the one of the detail about the DAO authentication provider is how we should find out or how we should fetch the user information and give it to the Spring Security. So in order to do that, Spring Security provides a user detail service interface, and that has a one method which we can use to load the information and pass it to the Spring Security. So for that one, we are going to create a custom user detail service. All right, and at the end of it, we are going to see end-to-end demo for our application. Just to set the expectation at a right level, I'm not going to get into the deeper details of how the different filters work, how it basically convert that user details and things, but definitely in the second part of this tutorial, I'm going to talk about the internals of the login process. And this is kind of a high level of overview, end-to-end work process for a login controller or a login process, right? We as a customer, what happen is, let's assume that I want to access something which is secured for a logged in customers. And if you remember from our last discussion, anything that start with the account is a secured page. So assume that I want to go to my account section. I sent a request for that one. Sorry for that. Okay, now there are certain Spring Security interceptors and filters which we have already covered in our previous discussions. They will intercept the request. They understand that, oh, hey, this is basically for a secure part of the application. Is the user already authenticated? Let's say if that is not authenticated, and there will be an access denied exception, and you will be redirected back to the login page. If you follow the numbering of that one, you will get an understanding, right? So you have the login page. Now you fill all the details, and you if those are valid details, then the Spring Security will authorize you and give you access to the to that secured resource. So that's an overall idea how the login process works. So this is the login page. I am using a Thymee leaf for the UI part, so I am using that one. If you're using a JSP or free marker, just you have to make sure that you are working as as per the requirement. Okay, so there are a couple of things which you have to be very clear when you are using a custom login page. All right, so your action and the method will always be post, and your action is always going to be /login. So that's the first requirement. You have to make sure that it's exactly the same, so that Spring Security understand and intercept and start the process for you. Okay, now there are fundamentally two things what we need in order to validate you if you are using a login page, right? One is your username and the second one is your password. What you have to be careful on one thing, the name of the field has to be username. Okay, that is a requirement from the Spring Security perspective. In the second part of this tutorial, I will tell you why that is required and how Spring Security internally use that one. For now, keep in mind that the name of your username field should be username, and the name of your password field should be password. So that's the only fundamental requirement when you are building your login HTML page or your JSP page or a free marker page. Okay, there are a few other things. For example, Spring Security automatically going to inject a token to handle few of the security scenarios. We will talk about that one, but so that's the first thing what we have to do. Now in terms of the second thing, we will create a login controller. Okay, and so I'm going to web section, I'm going to controller, and I'm going to go to the controller. Okay, so we will add a one mapping here, and then we will add a method, and I'm going to tell you why we need those two things. All right, so we have added that one. Next thing but I'm going to add is I will add a request mapping. Okay, not this one, request mapping, and that will be for the login page. Okay, now the question is, why do we need this one, right? So if you don't do that one, by default, if there is a requirement for a login page, right, Spring Security is going to give a get request to /login, and that will be intercepted by the default the controller or the mapper from the Spring Security, and they will give you their default login page. So what we are doing here is we are creating a controller, mapping it with the /login URL. So any request with /login will be handled by this login controller, and within the we have defining a one get mapping. So that's the default method that will be executed, and we are returning account.login. So that is the same login page we have created. Okay, so what you understood, right? What we are trying to do is creating our own login page and mapping it with that one. Okay, now the next thing what we are going to do is, so this is our default configuration for the Spring Security, right? Okay, so in this one we will tell Spring Security, okay, what to do, right? So now in this one, before I add something, what I'm saying is show a login form, right? And I'm saying is if everything looks good, go to the success URL, otherwise I have to configure few things. So what I have to do is I have to tell Spring Security that if there is a login, right, where it should pick, should it go back to the default implementation or should it go to our controller? Okay, all right guys, so I have added this one. So what I'm doing here is I'm telling Spring Security that where it should pick the login page. So I'm saying that if there is a request for a login page, go to this URL, which is our login page URL, right? And then in case of a failure, go back to the same URL. And the reason why I want to go back to the same URL, so that even in case of a login error, I'm able to give them the same login page, right? And just I'm passing one additional parameter so that I can handle it and show the error message. So with that, this one, right, for the login page, you will get the login screen. Okay, so let's see that in action before we go to the next part. All right, so our application got started. So let's go to the account page. Okay, we will try to go to the account page. So if we go to the account page, we have the login screen, and if you remember, this screen is different than the default login screen, and the reason for that one is it's going to our with this configuration, okay, where we are saying that login page URL is /login, failure URL is this one, so it is going to our login page controller. Okay, so now that set the expectation, but there are few things missing right now. Spring don't know how to load the user information into the system because we have not configured it. So the next thing what we are going to do is we are going to create a custom user detail service. We are going to implement one of the interface provided by the Spring Security. We will put the logic how we should load the user information, or kind of based upon the username, and we will create an user account for that one. So let me increase the size. Okay, so this is our custom user detail service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement the user detail service. Okay, so this is an interface from the Spring Security. Okay, you see, and there is only one method in this interface which says load user by username, and username can be anything. It can be email, it can be something else, right? And we are responsible to provide an implementation for this method, so they will let us to define it. Okay, so we are implementing this one. So there will be only one interface. Okay, will be only one method. Let me close this one. So that's an overall detail. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use our user repository. If you remember from our previous lesson, we have created user repository, right? And this user repository is have all the code or all the details how the information should be loaded into the system. For example, how the customer user detail or the customer detail will be saved. And in this user repository, we have defined this method find by email, because for us email ID is the login ID. Okay, so we will be using this method to load the customer information. Okay, so this is the default implementation for our, okay, there is something wrong, mismatch. Okay, this is extra. All right. Okay, so what we are doing here is, first thing what we are trying to do is, with our user repository we are calling find by email and trying to see if there is any customer. If there is a customer, right, if let's take the first case, if there is no customer, we are going to throw the username not found exception, and that will be taken care automatically by the Spring Security, and you will get an error saying, hey, we are not able to find this customer. Okay, now let's say we have a valid information in the system, so the user entity will not be empty, correct? So in this case, Spring is expecting us to return this user detail interface. Okay, and that's again an interface, and it has certain information. For example, what are the different authorities to the user which decide if you are authorized to access certain areas or not. What is the password, what is the username, if account not expired. I will be talking about all these details into the advanced chapter, but let's not get deviated into that one. Okay, but in short, what Spring is expecting us to return back is a user object in itself. So we are filling that information saying customer email will be a username, password we already know, customer password, and this will be our encoded password. Now this is an interesting thing, but I will keep it for the later section of this this tutorial, right? But authorities basically derives what kind of a permissions you have. So to connect those two things, let's go back to our app security configuration, and you see what we are setting here is that anything that matches with account, this one should have an authority, as so the customer should have a user role at least. Only that a customer or a user with a user role or authority as an user will be allowed to access this one. Okay, and now this is what exactly we are doing here. So if we are saying if it's a valid user, apart from setting few details as an authority, we are setting it as an user. Right now I'm setting it as an hard-coded as an user, but while working toward this series, we will change it and we will go with the advanced methodologies, how you can make it more configurable, and how the modern applications works when they set the authorities and the authorizations. Okay, so now that part is done. Okay, if you see, right, so now we have created this customer user detail service, and we are basically finding out the user and then filling all the details. The last thing which is remaining is now we need to tell the Spring Security what is the authentication provider, right? Which authentication provider it should use to authenticate the user. And as I said initially, we will be using the DAOAuthentication Provider. Okay, all right, so this is our DAOAuthentication Provider. So what we are going to do is we will say authentication provider is equal to new DAOAuthentication Provider, and this authentication provider we are going to configure few things. Okay, first thing is we are going to set the password encoder, and the reason why we need this one is, if you remember from our registration process, we are using the vcrypt as our encoder one, right? So when we are trying to log in, Spring Security should use exactly the same encoding mechanism to encode the incoming password, because that's the only way it can match and decide if those are valid credential or not. Okay, so we have already defined this password encoder. Okay, and just to save some time, I have already defined this user detail service which we created. Okay, so we have this user detail service. Okay, so next thing what we are going to do in our authentication provider is we are going to set the user detail service. Okay, and that is going to be our user detail service. Now how it works is, in our DAO and we will say return our DAO authentication provider. Sorry, we'll say DAO authentication provider. Okay, so the way it's going to work, so as of now this is not complete. We have created our DAO authentication provider. There is last step which is still remaining. What we are doing here is, this DAO authentication provider will be used by the Spring Security to verify the customer. For when the customer provide a password, Spring Security, we are basically injecting our password encoder which we have used as an encoding mechanism. So Spring Security will use this password encoder. Now the next thing what our provider needs is a way to load the customer information, so that they can or a way a logic how we should load the customer information from the database or an underlying system. Okay, that's on us. How do we implement it? So in our custom user detail service, we have already written the logic, and with this configuration we are basically injecting this service so that Spring can use it to load the customer information. Okay, all right, so the last part is we have to tell Spring Security that which is the authentication provider it should use, and that is done through the configure method. This configure method takes an authentication manager builder, and what we are doing here is, in the authentication provider we are injecting our DAO authentication provider. And if you remember from our previous lesson, you already know how the authentication manager and the other things works, right? How that entire chain works together. So with this one, our end-to-end implementation is done. So what we have done so far is we created a custom login page in our Spring Security configuration. We configure our controller which is going to return our custom login page. Okay, we created a custom user detail service which have the logic how to load the customer information based by a email ID, and at last part of it we have created the bean as a DAO authentication provider, and within that DAO authentication provider we have injected our own password encoder and our own user detail service to let Spring use those one. And the final step is, in the authentication manager we are injecting our DAO authentication provider. All right, so let's go ahead and start the application, and then we will see a few things in action. Okay, all right, so our application got started and we are onto the login page. Let's reload the page. Okay, so I have this extension which is going to give us some information about the cookies. Okay, so let's open this one, and you see there is already a JSession ID. If you don't know, JSession ID is a cookie generated by all of our application. Most of the applications are like, for example, Tomcat, Jetty and all those things, and it's a way to manage the user session. Okay, so keep an eye on this one. Okay, so I'm going to open a second browser, keep it here. And the reason why I want to do it, once we do the login, this will be changed, and the reason is because Spring Security will create a new session and assign a new session to our request. Okay, so we have already, if you remember from our registration page, we have already created an account with this email. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and fill the password, click on a sign in page. So right now if you see, we are onto the login page. Okay, sorry, we are onto the my account section. Now this is the new session ID. Okay, right? So this is different than what was created initially, right? So the reason why this happened is, so Spring Security basically made sure that you are verified, validated, and then it creates a new session for you, and it's part of the security session fixation strategies, but I will talk about that later on. But the whole idea is it's creating a new session or a cookie ID for you, which is a way for it to maintain the session. So if I reload it, you will remain there because now I have a valid session. So let's do one thing. What we are going to do is we are going to delete this cookie, because that's the way Spring actually handling your login process, right? There should be some communication between your browser and the underlying framework, Spring Security and other framework, right? Which understand that if it's a valid session, is it a logged in session or not. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to refresh the page. So you see, I removed that session ID, and now since the communication happened and there was no valid session, so I got logged out. All right. So I hope that will give you an idea how the basic login process works into the Spring Security, how you can create a custom login page, which is, I think, a most common requirement for any of the enterprise application. Okay. And then in the next lesson, we are going to get a deeper into the login process. I'm going to talk about the different filter chains, how they internally works, how these are authentication providers works all together. And the last thing which I quickly want to cover, I'm sorry, this is going to be a longer tutorial again, but if you remember, we have created in this one. Okay, where is my security configuration? Yeah, that's the one, right? So what we have done is, in case of a failure, we are redirecting customer back to the error page, right? Login page, and then we are passing this method. So I'm going to fill some random thing, and now it is saying error is equal to true, because that's what I told Spring Security, that in case of error, go back to the login URL but add this parameter. And now I can use this parameter a multiple way. For this session, what I have done is I have added a section here, right? I am saying if the request parameter contains a param as an error, all right, show this message, and this is being driven from the our resource bundle. All right, so this is one way of handling it. The other way, if you don't want to do like this, let's say you want to add some more custom logic into your error handling scenarios. Maybe you want to go to the different URL. If you want to go to the different URL, all you have to do is in the fail URL, you can say my custom URL, right? And then you can do whatever you want to do. But let's say you still want to go to the login page and do some additional work there. So what you can do is, because this, you know that this is a request parameter, right? So in your login controller, all you have to do is you can always add a request parameter here, right? And you can collect it, and then you can do the custom logic, whatever you want to do. This is how it look like. And then you can say if login error, if its value is true, here you can do whatever you want to do. You want to call some service, some additional logic, go ahead and do that. All right. Okay, so that's it, the expectation. As I said, in the next one, we are going to get into a deeper detail. I hope that this will give you some basic understanding of the login process within the Spring Security. If you like this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe to my channel because I'm going to cover the entire Spring Security end-to-end implementation in this channel.